All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into meritocracy, a concept that on the surface seems pretty straightforward. It's about getting ahead based on your own merit, right?
Right.
But when you start to peel back the layers, it gets a lot more complicated. Like David Miller and Amartya Sen, some pretty heavy hitters in philosophy,
Mm.
pointed out even defining what merit means is a lot trickier than you might think.
Yeah, yeah.
And so for this deep dive, we're going to try to really act as philosophers ourselves. We're going to really dig deep and see if we can make sense of this whole meritocracy thing.
Yeah, that's a fantastic idea. And it's a word, merit, that we use so often. But when you actually stop and think about it, what are we really talking about? What does it even mean to have merit, and how do you measure it?
Right.
And, this idea of meritocracy, it's not just some abstract philosophical concept. It's woven into so many aspects of our lives. I mean, think about it. It shapes how we think about governments, how we structure our education systems, even our own personal beliefs about what's fair and what people deserve.
Absolutely. And it's not a new idea either.
Mm.
I mean, we can trace this concept all the way back to ancient philosophies, both in the East and the West. Like,
Yeah.
you've got Confucius over in the East, emphasizing the importance of virtue in education and leadership.
Right.
And then you've got Plato and Aristotle in the West, grappling with ideas of justice and the qualities that make for a good ruler.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And that long history, I think, really underscores something important. Meritocracy isn't a fixed, unchanging idea. It's been interpreted and reinterpreted in so many different ways over time and across different cultures.
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of what we want to explore in this deep dive. We want to trace those historical threads, grapple with the conceptual challenges, and see how those philosophical debates are still playing out today.
Yeah, exactly. And for you, the listener, I think a key takeaway here is this. It's not just about passively absorbing information. It's about engaging actively with these ideas. It's about asking yourself, what does it mean to act as a philosopher? And how can I apply that kind of critical thinking to my own understanding of meritocracy?
Yeah.
Yeah, so philosophers tend to approach meritocracy from two main angles.
Okay.
One is as a form of governance, so who should rule, and the second is as a theory of justice. So how should society's resources and opportunities be distributed?
Yeah, that's a great framework. So first up, let's dive into meritocracy as a way to govern.
Great?
Now, in Eastern thought, they often use the term political meritocracy.
Yeah.
And in the West, it's more common to hear the term ebistocracy, which basically means rule by those with knowledge, expertise.
Right.
But both of these concepts share this fundamental idea that the people in charge, the people making the decisions, should be those who are most qualified, those with the most merit, however you define that.
Yeah, and that right there is a huge question, isn't it? Like, how do you define merit in the context of governing? Are we talking about like practical skills, experience? Are we talking about some kind of innate wisdom or virtue? And even if you could agree on what those qualities are, how do you actually measure them?
Yes, it's a really tricky question. I mean, is it about someone's track record of success, their ability to make sound judgments?
Hmm.
Or is it more about their character, their moral compass?
Right.
And then even if you could identify these meritocrats, how would they govern? What kind of structure would you need?
Right.
And crucially, would it even be a fair system? I mean, that's a big one, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That question of fairness and justifiability is paramount, I think. Any system that concentrates power in the hands of a select few, it has to address those concerns about fairness, about potential for abuse. I mean, for you, the listener, think about this. How do you prevent a meritocratic government from becoming just another form of elitism, where a small group of people are making decisions for everyone else without really understanding their needs?
Yeah, that's a really important point. So let's look at a specific example from the Eastern tradition, this idea of new Confucian meritocracy
Hmm.
that scholars like Daniel Bell and Tongdong Bai have been talking about.
Okay.
So it's kind of a hybrid system. They envision it as a system that combines elements of democracy with a stronger emphasis on merit, especially at the higher levels of government.
Uh-huh.
And the way they see it, merit would be determined through these rigorous examinations, kind of like the civil service exams that some countries have used historically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's important to consider the context here. This new Confucian meritocracy is often put forward as a response to some of the perceived shortcomings of Western-style liberal democracies. Its proponents often point to the economic success and stability of certain East Asian countries, like China, as evidence for its potential effectiveness.
Yeah, that's a key part of their argument. And, it's a complex issue.
Yeah.
There are definitely a lot of factors that go into a country's success, and it's hard to isolate the effects of any particular system of government.
Right. And it raises this deeper philosophical question, doesn't it? When we're talking about meritocracy, are we primarily concerned with achieving certain outcomes, like economic growth or stability, or are we more concerned with upholding certain principles of fairness and justice, regardless of the outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And I think that tension between outcomes and principles is something that we'll see playing out throughout our discussion of meritocracy.
Now, over in the Western tradition, one of the most famous examples of a meritocratic system of government is Plato's idea of the philosopher king,
Right, right.
right? So Plato believed that the ideal ruler would be someone who possessed these specific intellectual and moral virtues, things like bravery, wisdom, self-control. He argued that these qualities were essential for making good decisions, for governing justly.
Right.
And he was pretty skeptical of democracy. He thought that, ordinary people just didn't have the knowledge or the temperament to rule effectively.
Yeah. Plato's vision of the philosopher king, it's a pretty radical idea, isn't it? I mean, it raises this question of, can you really identify those individuals who possess those ideal qualities?
Right.
And even if you could, how do you prevent them from becoming corrupted by power?
Yeah, and practically speaking, like, how do you even choose a philosopher king who
Yeah.
gets to decide?
Yeah.
So, moving on from this idea of a single all-wise ruler, let's talk about restricted suffrage. This is the idea that not everyone should have the right to vote, that voting should be restricted to those who are deemed competent or qualified in some way.
Right.
Now, the philosopher Jason Brennan has made a pretty interesting argument in favor of this. He argues that it's actually a matter of rights. He says that people have a right not to be subjected to incompetent or irrational political decisions.
Yeah.
And he suggests that, restricting voting to those who are more knowledgeable or informed would lead to better outcomes for everyone.
Yeah, it's a thought-provoking argument, but it's really important to consider the historical context here. I mean, throughout history, the idea of restricting suffrage has often been used to exclude certain groups from political participation based on, criteria that were often arbitrary or discriminatory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about the fight for women's suffrage
Right.
or the struggles against racial disenfranchisement.
Exactly. So, for you, the listener, think about this. How do you ensure that any modern attempt to restrict suffrage doesn't just reproduce those same patterns of exclusion?
Yeah, that's a really important question.
And it really makes us think about, who gets to decide who's competent, what are the criteria, and how do you prevent those criteria from being biased against certain groups?
So another approach, slightly less radical than restricted suffrage, is John Stuart Mill's idea of plural voting.
Okay.
Now, Mill wasn't in favor of excluding anyone from voting, but he did think that some people should have more votes than others.
Okay.
And his reasoning was that, people with higher levels of education or expertise should have more say in political decision-making.
Right. So it's not about excluding anyone, but it's about weighting the votes differently
Yeah, exactly.
based on some kind of measure of knowledge or competence.
Yeah. And he actually proposed a pretty specific system for this. He suggested that, an unskilled laborer might get 1 vote, a skilled laborer might get 2, a foreman might get 3, a professional might get 5 or 6, and a university graduate might get even more.
Wow. So he really tried to put some numbers to this idea,
Yeah.
but it raises some really tricky questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, who decides on those categories and, and how many votes each one gets? I mean, it seems like that could easily be manipulated to favor certain groups over others.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you've got this question of, like, what about people who don't fit neatly into those categories? What about people with practical skills who may not have a formal education?
Right, right. It's a very complex idea to try to put into practice.
Now, moving towards a more moderate approach,
Hmm.
you have the concept of limited epistocracy.
Okay.
So this isn't about restricting voting rights, but it's about trying to give more weight or influence to informed citizens or specialized institutions within a democratic system?
Right. So it's about like trying to find ways to incorporate expertise into decision making without completely abandoning the principles of democracy.
Yeah, exactly. So it could be things like, creating citizen assemblies made up of randomly selected but highly informed citizens,
Uh-huh.
or giving more power to independent expert bodies to advise on policy.
Right. And this idea of limited epistocracy, it's really interesting because it makes us think about like what's the best way to balance the need for informed decision making with the democratic ideal of equal participation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then you have Jason Brennan again coming in with some more, let's say, unconventional ideas,
Okay.
like government by simulated oracle, where you try to predict what a fully informed electorate would decide,
Okay.
and values-only voting,
Hmm.
where citizens only vote on broad goals, and then experts figure out the best way to achieve them.
Yeah, those are definitely some out of the box ideas.
Yeah.
But they do highlight this fundamental tension, don't they? Between the desire for more effective, more rational decision making and the core principles of democracy where everyone's voice is supposed to count equally.
Yeah, it really pushes you to think about the role of expertise in a democracy,
Right.
and how you balance that with the rights of citizens to have a say in how they're governed.
Exactly.
Okay, last one in this governance section. This one's from a philosopher named Lopez Guerra. And he proposes using lotteries to select a well-informed subset of citizens to vote.
Oh, interesting.
So every citizen would have a chance to be selected.
Uh-huh.
But the catch is that you would have to demonstrate that you're well-informed on the issues before you could actually cast your vote.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. It's like a hybrid of sortition where you're randomly selecting people to participate in government and epistocracy where you're prioritizing knowledge and expertise.
Yeah, exactly.
And it kind of raises this question, doesn't it? Like, could a randomly selected but well-informed group of citizens actually make better decisions than either the general electorate or a select group of experts?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought experiment. So, what have we learned about meritocracy as a form of governance? I mean, we're seeing a lot of different ideas here, from radical overhauls to more subtle tweaks to existing systems.
Yeah, and I think what's clear is that there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
Any attempt to design a meritocratic system of government has to grapple with these fundamental questions of what is merit? How do you measure it? How do you select for it?
Right.
And how do you prevent it from becoming just another form of elitism?
Okay, so let's shift gears now and talk about meritocracy as a theory of justice.
Okay.
Now, this is where things get a bit more philosophical.
Yeah.
Because here, the argument is that a just society is one where people get what they deserve based on their merit. So it's not just about who gets to govern. It's about how we distribute all sorts of things, like wealth, opportunities, social status even.
Yeah, and that raises another big question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, what do we mean by deserve? Are we talking about people getting rewards that are proportional to their efforts?
Right.
Or are we talking about something else entirely?
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the key figures in this debate is a philosopher named David Miller.
Okay.
Now, Miller doesn't fully embrace meritocracy. He kind of gives it what he calls two cheers.
Okay.
He argues that in certain areas of life, particularly what he calls instrumental associations like workplaces, it does make sense to distribute rewards based on merit.
Okay.
But he also thinks that there are other areas, like the family or the political sphere, where meritocratic principles shouldn't be the primary guiding force.
Yeah, so he's arguing for a more nuanced approach, that meritocracy has its place, but it shouldn't be the only principle of justice that we consider.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have another philosopher, Thomas Mulligan, who takes a much stronger stance.
Okay.
He argues that justice is solely a matter of desert, that people should get exactly what they deserve, no more, no less, based on their merits.
Okay, so he's taking a much more absolute view.
Yeah, a much more absolute view. And he points out that this idea, this intuition that people should get what they deserve, is something that seems to resonate across cultures, across different fields of study.
Right, right. And I think that's an important point to consider. I mean, there's something very intuitively appealing about this idea of fairness, that people should be rewarded for their efforts and achievements, that they shouldn't be held back or unfairly advantaged by factors outside of their control.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are other philosophers who have offered justifications for meritocratic norms.
Okay.
George Scher, for example, argues that judging people based on their merits is actually a way of respecting their autonomy. It's about recognizing their agency, their ability to make choices and take actions that shape their own lives.
Right.
And then there's this idea of fittingness that, the very nature of a particular social good should dictate how it's distributed.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you're talking about, building a bridge, it makes sense that the most skilled engineers should be the ones doing the job.
Right. Right. Because the nature of the task itself kind of points to what the relevant qualifications are.
Yeah, exactly. So let's get more concrete and talk about how meritocracy might apply to the distribution of jobs.
Okay.
So ideally, in a meritocratic system, hiring decisions would be based solely on qualifications, skills, experience, without any discrimination based on irrelevant factors like race or gender.
Right.
And, this is something that Martin Luther King Jr. famously spoke about, this dream of a society where people are judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin.
Absolutely. And we've actually seen examples of this in practice, like the use of blind auditions in orchestras,
Right.
where musicians are judged solely on their performance without the judges knowing their gender or race.
Yeah, and studies have shown that this has actually led to a significant increase in the number of women and minorities being hired in orchestras.
Yeah, so it's a really concrete example of how focusing on merit and removing bias from the selection process can lead to more equitable outcomes.
But here's the catch, right?
Yeah.
Defining and measuring merit in the real world is a lot more complex than it might seem at first glance.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, what about things like reaction qualifications?
Yes, sir.
These are qualities that might not be directly related to the job itself, but they can influence how people perceive you, and that can affect your chances of getting hired.
Right.
So, for example, is being conventionally attractive a merit if it helps someone in a sales job?
Yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it? Because it's not directly related to their ability to sell, but it might give them an advantage in certain situations.
Yeah, and it raises this question of, like, where do you draw the line between genuine merit and just arbitrary advantages that some people happen to have?
Exactly. And this is where things get really tricky because those arbitrary advantages are often tied to things like social class, race, gender, all those factors that, ideally a meritocratic system would try to eliminate.
Right. And then, of course, you have the whole debate about affirmative action,
Yeah.
which is a really contentious issue.
Yeah.
Strict meritocrats often oppose affirmative action policies, things like quotas or preferential treatment, arguing that they undermine the whole principle of merit-based selection.
Right.
But then you have others who argue that because of historical and ongoing discrimination, some forms of affirmative action are actually necessary to level the playing field, to ensure that everyone has a fair shot to demonstrate their merit.
Yeah, and it really comes down to how you view the role of meritocracy in a society that's already deeply unequal.
Yeah, exactly.
Is the goal to simply reward those who excel within the existing system? Or is it to try to create a more just system, even if that means temporarily deviating from strict meritocratic principles?
So let's move on to the meritocratic distribution of income.
Okay.
So the basic idea here is that people's earnings should reflect their economic contribution to society.
Right.
And, economists have various ways of trying to measure this contribution.
Yeah.
There's things like willingness to pay, consumer surplus, marginal product. But all of these measures are based on this idea that, economic value is ultimately subjective. It's determined by what people are willing to pay for goods and services.
Right.
But then you run into this problem of, like, how do you separate an individual's contribution from the contributions of everyone else they work with or the tools and resources that they use?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's often referred to as the entanglement problem. And it really highlights the importance of equal opportunity in a meritocratic system. Because if you want people's economic outcomes to truly reflect their merit, you have to ensure that everyone has a fair chance to develop their skills and talents in the first place.
Right. I mean, if someone is born into poverty and they don't have access to good education or health care, how can you say that their economic outcomes are solely a reflection of their merit?
Exactly. And then you have this concept of economic rent, which is essentially income that's not tied to any actual productive activity.
Okay.
So think about someone who inherits a lot of money or property,
Right.
or someone who profits from a monopoly or some other kind of market distortion.
Yeah.
They're receiving income without actually contributing anything to the economy.
Right.
And this is something that economists and philosophers who are concerned about inequality have pointed to as a major problem.
Yeah, and it seems like a pretty clear violation of meritocratic principles, right?
Right, because you're getting ahead not because of your efforts or your talents, but because of factors that are completely outside of your control.
Yeah, absolutely. So putting all of this together, it seems like a truly functioning meritocracy,
Yeah.
one that managed to eliminate inherited wealth and economic rents,
Uh-huh.
could actually end up being more egalitarian than the systems we have now.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought.
Yeah.
That a true meritocracy might actually lead to less inequality.
Yeah, because the inequalities that would remain would be based on individual choices,
Yeah.
efforts, maybe some natural talents,
Right.
but not on these arbitrary advantages that people inherit or acquire through luck.
Yeah, and it really challenges us to think about like what would a truly level playing field look like?
Yeah.
And how could we create a system that rewards people based on their actual contributions to society?
Okay, we've spent a lot of time talking about the theory of meritocracy,
Mm-hmm.
both as a form of government and as a principle of justice.
Yeah.
But what about the objections? Because there are certainly plenty of those.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that, even though meritocracy has a kind of intuitive appeal,
Yeah.
it's been subject to a lot of criticism from different philosophical perspectives.
Yeah, and one of the most influential critiques comes from the philosopher John Rawls.
Okay.
Now, Rawls argues that the very idea of deserving something based on your natural talents or abilities
Hmm.
is problematic, because he says that those talents and abilities are ultimately the result of luck.
Okay.
You don't choose your genes, you don't choose the circumstances you're born into.
Right.
So how can you say that you deserve anything based on those factors?
Yeah, it's a really powerful argument, and it kind of undermines this whole notion that, we're self-made individuals who are solely responsible for our own success
Right.
because it forces us to recognize the role of chance, the role of luck in our lives.
And Rawls also raises some practical concerns about meritocracy.
Oh, yeah.
Like, how do you actually measure merit fairly?
Yeah.
What are the criteria?
Yeah.
And who gets to decide?
Right. And even if you could come up with a perfect system for measuring merit,
Yeah.
he argues that it might not be the system that we would choose if we were starting from a position of equality.
Right.
So he imagines this thought experiment called the original position, where people are behind a veil of ignorance.
Okay.
They don't know what their own social position or talents or abilities will be.
Yeah.
And he argues that in that situation, people would actually choose a more egalitarian system, one that prioritizes the well-being of the least advantaged.
Then you have thinkers who focus on relational equality, people like Elizabeth Anderson and Harry Brickhouse.
Okay.
And their concern is that even if you could create a perfectly fair meritocracy,
Yeah.
it might still have negative social consequences.
Okay.
Because they argue that meritocratic hierarchies can undermine our ability to relate to each other as equals.
Okay.
They can create divisions, resentments, even oppression.
Right. So they're focusing on the social and psychological effects of a system that's based on ranking and rewarding people based on their merit.
Yeah, and they argue that those effects can be really damaging, even if the system itself is fair.
Okay.
And then you have democratic theorists who have their own set of objections.
Right.
Some argue that meritocracy actually undermines democracy because it concentrates power in the hands of a select few, those who are deemed to have the most merit.
Right.
And they worry that this can lead to a kind of technocracy where experts rule and ordinary citizens have very little say in how they're governed.
Yeah, and some democratic theorists also question the epistemic basis of meritocracy.
Okay.
So they point to things like the Condorcet jury theorem, which suggests that large groups of people, even if they're not individually very knowledgeable, can collectively make good decisions.
Right.
And they argue that this wisdom of the crowd is something that meritocracy often overlooks.
And then you have libertarians who have their own set of critiques.
Yep.
Right libertarians in particular are very skeptical of any kind of government intervention that aims to enforce a meritocratic distribution.
Okay.
So they would oppose things like redistributive taxation or affirmative action policy
Right.
because they see them as violations of individual liberty.
Right. And they also worry about the practical difficulties of trying to create a meritocracy.
Yeah.
They argue that it would require a huge amount of government power to monitor and enforce meritocratic principles.
Right.
And they worry that this could easily lead to tyranny.
Yeah, and they also point out that, everything is based on merit, then people lose their excuses for failure.
Right.
And that could be a real problem for people's self-esteem, for their sense of agency.
Right. And I think that's a point that even non-libertarians should take seriously. What are the psychological effects of living in a society where everything is supposedly based on merit?
And beyond these major schools of thought, there are other objections to meritocracy as well. Some argue that it's actually incompatible with certain other values that we hold dear, like compassion or solidarity.
Okay.
Others worry that it could lead to a kind of social Darwinism, where the strong thrive and the weak are left behind.
Yeah, and there are also empirical questions about whether meritocracy is even achievable in practice.
Right.
Um, can you really create a system that accurately measures and rewards merit?
Yeah.
Or will there always be biases and distortions that prevent a true meritocracy from emerging?
So, okay, we've seen that there are a lot of philosophical objections to meritocracy.
Right.
But what about the public debate?
Right.
Because, lately there seems to be this growing sense that meritocracy is, well, kind of a myth.
Yeah, and I think that's partly because we've been living through a period of increasing inequality.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are starting to question whether the system is really fair, whether it's really rewarding merit.
Right. And I think there are two main reasons why the public debate around meritocracy is so messy.
Like-
First, as we've already discussed, there's just no clear definition of what meritocracy even means.
Right.
So people are often talking past each other, arguing about different things.
Yeah.
And second, people often conflate the normative question of whether meritocracy is a good thing with the empirical question of whether our societies are actually meritocratic.
Right.
So, you have some people who think meritocracy is great, and they think we're already living in one,
Yeah.
even though the evidence might suggest otherwise.
Right.
And then you have others who think meritocracy is a terrible idea, and they think we're already living in one.
Yeah.
And they're horrified by it.
Yeah, it's a really confusing landscape, and I think it's really important to try to disentangle those two questions,
Yeah.
to first try to agree on what we mean by meritocracy, and then to look at the evidence and see whether our societies actually live up to that ideal.
And you could almost categorize commentators based on their answers to those two questions.
Oh.
Like, do they think meritocracy is a good thing, and do they think we've achieved it?
Right.
So you have people like Greg Mankiw, who's an economist who's very much in favor of meritocracy, and he thinks we're basically there.
Okay.
And then you have people like Thomas Mulligan, who we mentioned earlier, who's also a big proponent of meritocracy, but he thinks we still have a long way to go.
Okay.
And then you have people like Daniel Markovits, who's written this book called The Meritocracy Trap, who thinks meritocracy is actually a bad thing, and he thinks we're, deeply stuck in it.
Okay.
And then you have people like Miranda Fricker,
Mm-hmm.
who's a philosopher who's also quite critical of meritocracy. But she thinks that, we're not really living in a true meritocracy because there are all these systemic biases that prevent people from being judged fairly on their merits.
Right. And I think a good example of how these different perspectives play out is the debate about affirmative action.
Yeah.
Some people see affirmative action as a necessary corrective to historical injustices and ongoing discrimination. They argue that it's essential.